So, there's this really big idea floating around that could, well, completely shake up global politics as we know it. Donald Trump's Board of Peace. Today, we're going to break down what one source analysis reveals about this proposal, looking at everything from how it's supposed to work to the pretty stark warnings it raises. Let's dive in.
And right off the bat, the analysis we're digging into kicks things off with a massive question. Is this whole thing designed to be a direct competitor to the United Nations? I mean, that's a bold thought, and it really sets the stage for everything else we're about to unpack.
Okay, so to even begin to answer that, we first have to get our heads around what this Board of Peace is actually supposed to be. Let's peel back that first layer and look at the structure, at least as it's laid out in the source material.
At its very core, the article describes the Board of Peace as a U.S.-controlled alternative to the UN, and the keywords they use are really telling. Nimble, which, suggests it can act fast without all the red tape, but also unaccountable, which implies it would operate totally outside of the usual international checks and balances. And right at the center of it all, the United States.
So how do you get a permanent spot at this new, very exclusive table? Well, get this. The price of admission, according to the source, is a cool $1 billion. Right away, that tells you this isn't about universal representation like you see at the UN. This is an exclusive club, and the entry fee is steep. And the power, wow. The analysis points to this incredible concentration of power. The chair, who, in this proposal, would be Donald Trump, could literally appoint or even kick out member states. They could create or get rid of entire committees, basically on a whim. And this is crucial, the author notes that all of this would be happening without any clear foundation in international law. So after laying out all those details, the U.S. control, the billion-dollar price tag, the unchecked power, the author presents their central argument. They conclude that, this probably isn't about building peace in the traditional sense. Instead, they frame it as a machine for institutionalizing American dominance. In other words, U.S. hegemony, where one country has overwhelming influence over everyone else. Now, to build their case, the author looks at where this idea supposedly came from, which is reportedly tied to figuring out the future governance of Gaza, but this is where the analysis says things just don't add up. In this slide just lays out that disconnect plain and simple. On the left, you have the stated reason. This is about Gaza. But then you look at the author's findings on the right, and it's pretty stark. The board's own charter apparently makes zero mention of Gaza, and there's no planned representation for Palestinians. It's a huge contradiction. So if the author's arguing it's not truly about Gaza, then what's the real game here? Well, that brings us to what they see as the core of this whole thing, the battle between raw power and established law. And here we see another one of those fundamental clashes. The proposal apparently claims it's all about promoting lawful governance, but the author argues that its very structure is designed to do the exact opposite, to basically reject international law, empower the use of force by one country, and just ignore any institution that might get in the way. And the author is really clear that this shouldn't be seen in a vacuum. They argue it's just one piece of a much bigger puzzle, connecting it to a wider strategy of, course of foreign policy that includes things like pressuring NATO allies and using economic tariffs as weapons. Okay, so we've talked geopolitics, but now the analysis takes a really fascinating turn, shifting from the global stage to, psychology. The author suggests the reasons for creating this whole new organization might not just be strategic, they might be deeply personal. And this is a pretty striking claim. The article alleges that this entire grand concept of a board of peace might actually be rooted in resentment over not winning the Nobel Peace Prize. The author puts a label on it: ego-driven geopolitics. Yeah, the source really doesn't pull any punches here. The final label they use for this alleged motivation is incredibly direct and powerful: megalomania, not statesmanship. It's a very, very strong critique. So what are the real-world stakes here? What could actually happen? The analysis wraps up with a final and pretty chilling warning about the potential consequences of all this. The article zooms right in on the proposed Gaza Executive Board. Looking at the people on this list, the author immediately flags a total lack of Palestinian voices. And they also point to figures like former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair. The critique here is that this setup looks a lot less like impartial governance and a lot more like a kind of old-school colonial administration. And tied to this board is a proposed military arm, the International Stabilization Force, or ISF. The idea is that it's a multinational force, but, and this is a big but, It would be led by a U.S. military officer, and its job would be security and demilitarization. And this is where the author raises a huge red flag. They warn that a force like this, given its structure and who's in charge, could very easily end up in combat with Palestinian resistance groups instead of doing its stated job of protecting civilians. The article even gives a specific piece of advice to Pakistan, warning them against getting involved. So it all builds to this, the author's final judgment. It really boils down to three main points. First, they argue the board won't bring stability. It'll actually speed up the collapse of the current global order. Second, it champions the idea of rule by pure power over the rule of law. And third, that a U.S.-led rival to the UN is, just by its very existence, a destabilizing force in the world. And the analysis concludes with this one powerful sentence, which, well, it pretty much sums up the author's entire viewpoint on the whole thing. So in the end, this analysis leaves us with a really critical question. Is this Board of Peace a bold new path to solving conflicts? Or, as this author argues, could it actually kick off a dangerous new era of global instability? It's definitely something to think about.